Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. In this video, I'm going to talk about SP and IDP. So what is SP and what is IDP? You might have heard these terms while integrating single sign-on, right? And so SP is an service provider and IDP is an identity provider, right? So those are the two terms, or we can say those are the key parameters or key uh, things that are needed, or those are very important during setting up the single sign-on, right? And even while making the single sign-on between different applications with identity providers, so there are so many identity providers. Few of the examples includes Microsoft Entra ID, as well as Okta and many others, right? So these are the different identity providers where we would be integrating with different business applications. It could be Salesforce, Adobe, NetSuite, DocuSign, and many more business applications. And even there are applications which we can integrate with those applications which are developed and built in-house, and we have set up the, or we are using the modern authentication methods, includes OIDC or OAuth 2.0, right? So those are also be capable enough to integrate with Entra ID, as well as all those identity providers like Okta, Entra ID, and all others, right? So in this context, or in this video specifically, I'm going to talk more on to IDP, identity provider, and ASP, service provider, right? And how those works each other, or in between each other when single sign-on is set up, right, between service provider and the identity provider, and how those are shaking the hands between one another so that they are providing access to the applications, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to give you a bit of understanding before, and then I'm going to show you the demo as in I have already set up this single sign-on for one of the application, but I'm going to show you how we are logging in and what is the process is going to look like when you are signing into the application from application side, as well as from when the IDP is going to be triggered, when SP is going to be triggered, and when the connection is going to be built between both applications, and then deliver the connections, and it is going to be providing the authentication, right? So let's talk about what is IDP. IDP is going to be the mechanism or system, we can say, that is going to authenticate users and provide identity information to the application, which is service provider in this case, right? And it is responsible for verifying the user credentials and issuing authentication tokens, right? So that means if I am as a user trying to access a particular application, and when I enter my credentials to that application, it is going to simply prompt me to authenticate my credentials. Once I enter credentials, those credentials will be validated against the identity provider. Identity provider is going to be either Entra ID or Okta or any other identity provider. It is going to validate with that service. And once identity provider is validated, then it is going to return back that token to the respective service provider. Service provider is going to be an application. Application is going to be provided access to that identity, and that identity, as an individual user, they would be able to get into the system. They would get the access to that application directly. So, right. So this is the flow where it is going to, let's say, enter the credentials. User enters the credentials to the application. Then it goes to the identity provider. Identity provider validates the identity and credentials. Then it returns back to token to the service provider, and then the user gets the access, right? There are key functions for IDP, which stores and manages the user identities, right? It authenticates the users via passwords, MFA, or biometrics, and it also issues authentication tokens for different protocols, which includes SAML based tokens, OAuth, as well as OpenID Connect. And it allows users to sign in once and use multiple services or multiple applications in one go, right? And as I said, there are multiple identity providers, which includes Entra ID, Okta, Google Workspace is also one of the identity provider. OAuth and Salesforce is also considered as identity provider at certain limitation or certain range for Salesforce and different applications when we integrate it with, and there are many other identity providers. Now, how it works with SAML SSO, basically it uses or it acts users access the application that requires authentication when user tries to enter the credentials and log in. Then service provider redirects users to the IDP, as I said, and then IDP verifies the user identity credentials, and then if successful and everything is valid, then IDP sends an authentication token, which is SAML assertion, and then SP or service provider validates the tokens and grants the access, right? So these are the flows, or these are the steps we can directly see from the applications or between application as well as the identity provider, right? So this was all about the identity provider. Let's talk about service provider, right? So what is a service provider? Service provider is nothing but applications and system, right? Which is going to be relying on identity provider to authenticate users instead of managing user credentials themselves or within that respective service provider, right? And it is going to trust the identity providers in order to provide authentication and access to that respective application, right? And then there are also key functionalities for service provider, which redirects the users to IDP for authentication, process authentication tokens received from identity provider, and then grant the access based on validated user identity, right? So this was the key functions about service provider. Then let's talk about a few of the examples of service providers, which includes Microsoft 365 applications like Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange Online, right? So these are also applications of Microsoft. And in this context, there would be Enter ID as an identity provider, right? So there would be a token exchange between both sides, and it is going to simply provide those tokens based on identity validation and authentication, right? Next, it is going to be Salesforce, Dropbox, as well as AWS or any other business application. Those are also service providers where once we set up the SSO with those applications, we would be able to get into the systems with the single identity and upon identity validation and verification, right? And it also works the similar way when user tries to log into the service provider or respective application, then that respective application redirects to the identity provider for authentication. User enters the credentials or verifies the credentials, and then if successful, it is going to send the assertion or a token back to that service provider, and service provider validates that grant or access, and then the user gets the access to the system or application basically, right? So there are few differences as well in both SP as well as in IDP between identity provider and service provider. Basically, the purpose of it, let's say first difference is in the IDP context, authenticates users and issues token, but on the service side, it consumes the authentication tokens, and on the credentials side, on the IDP, it stores the credentials of users, but service provider does not store any credentials at all, right? So examples of IDP is going to be Enter ID, Okta, Google Workspace, Salesforce, even AWS has their own IDP, right? And on the service provider, it could be Salesforce, Dropbox, NetSuite, DocuSign, right? And other on the interaction side between IDP and service provider, IDP sends authentication response to the service provider, and service provider accepts authentication response from IDP, right? So that is the exchange of token between both IDP and SP, service provider, and the user directory. So IDP manages the user identities and it has a directory, but on the other side of that, SP does not have, or it does not manage the identities, and it does not have a separate directory, right? So this way it is going to manage all of that. And we can go ahead and simply try to see and log into the application, and I'll show you how it is going to happen, right? So let me go ahead and show you that quickly here. All right, let me log into an application. Okay, let me log out this application. I have logged in already. So let me share my screen. Perfect. So here is an application I have integrated with SSO. And you can see that I have given this name as organization name to this application. And this is the URL of this application. So boldest.com is one of the ticketing tool, right? And I have integrated with OAuth. So it is going to simply, once I click on this button, it is going to, so now I'm logging in from application as our service provider side. So this is a service provider login URL. You can see that, right? So now I can see the login page where I can enter the correct email address and password as I can simply click on SSO method where I have integrated it with. And then once I click on this, it is going to simply ask me to enter the credentials, right? And then it is going to say, okay, enter the credentials here and then log in. So I think it is going to, I have logged in it before. Maybe it is going to simply, I'll simply open another incognito window and I will log in there, right? So that it should not pick up the existing session and it is going to directly log in. Now, let's try again or let's log in. So now it is logging in. It is redirecting me to the my business email account, right? Here it has asked me to enter the credentials. So now this is my enter page, right? And from here, I need to enter my business email address. So once I enter my business email address and credentials, it is going to ask me to enter the password as well. And once I enter that, then it is going to redirecting that to the application. So now this is the process happening in the backend. Now you can see that it is redirected to the application and this is the window where it is asking me to either what to stay logged in or what. So I'll simply say no and we are in. So I'm logged into the application successfully with this credentials or this side because this is a service provider side where I logged in with my work credentials to this application, right? And this way, every user is able to get into the system directly, right? Now, even if I open this same URL on the same browser where I am logged in as an administrator, so let's go back and enter this URL. And you can see that it has picked up my credentials, which are already logged in, or there is an active session, right? Active session here with the Entra and with the same credentials, basically. So I have registered two different applications for setting up OIDC as well as OAuth connection or OAuth SSO connections on this application. And then it is going to be, or it is already set up. So it is working as expected. So this is what I wanted to show you how the SP is going to work, SP as a service provider side, as well as authentication or identity provider. So in this case, identity provider is going to be the one where it has identity created, it has identity attributes and everything together, and that is built and bind between identity provider and service provider. Now, there might be a question when we set up SSO, right? So in this case, SSO between that respective application and the identity provider, it is going to be wind or bind up together, right? And as I already configured it here, you can see that this is OAuth and I have configured it authentication URL as well as access token to it, and then set up the required details as well as the API permissions and everything together. So this is perfectly set up and it is configured appropriately, and that is why it is working and it is delivering and authenticating the users and user credentials basically, right? So once that is verified, user is able to get into the system and is able to log in, right? So yeah, that is all for this video I wanted to show and talk about, and I hope you will like it. Please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also watch other videos around Microsoft 365, Azure, Intra, and all other different topics that I have talked about. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and colleagues and put your questions and any doubts or anything that you wanted to ask and understand about this. And I would be happy to answer your queries there. So yeah, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.